Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, we're going to go ahead and remove the center cover. Typically, if you were to look along the rim and the center cover, you're going to find a little cutout. Carefully get in between there without damaging the wheel and gently pry this off. We'll just give it a quick inspection. You can set that aside, and now we can move along to removing all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off of here, let's have a look along the back side of the caliper. You're going to find your brake flex hose making its way all the way up here and then curving that way. Attached to the flex hose, you're also going to notice that you have your ABS wire. That's this little wire. You want to be very careful with this because it's delicate. We're going to go ahead and dislodge this from the flex hose. Now for this area right here, I'm just going to use a small flat screwdriver and gently pry it apart. Now we'll push this down right here, make our way all the way across. Essentially, we're just going to disconnect the ABS wire from the flex hose so that when we set the caliper aside, we're going to put no pressure on the ABS wire. Now that you have that separated, the next thing that we're going to do is move along to pushing back the 2 caliper pistons. You're going to have one that goes into this area and one right here. We'll just use our 14mm to remove our 2 caliper slider bolts. Now let's carefully remove the caliper from the bracket. Once you remove it from the bracket, you want to give it a quick inspection, especially where those pistons go into the caliper. If you see any liquid there, it's more than likely brake fluid, in which case you'd have to replace the caliper. Assuming this looks good, let's go ahead and carefully set it aside, putting no pressure on our flex hose, and we can continue. Now we can remove our brake pads and give them a quick inspection. When you're inspecting your brake pads, you want to make sure they're not worn at an odd angle. That would essentially tell you that you might be having an issue with the caliper. Next, we can move along to our 2 caliper bracket bolts. There's one down here, one up a little higher. We're going to use an 18mm to remove the pair. All right, now that one's nice and loose, I'll fully remove the second. Remove your caliper bracket, set it aside. Now we can go ahead and remove our rotor. Now with the rotor off of there, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the hub mating surface. As you can tell on this one in particular, it's extremely rusted along the mating surface where the brand new rotor is going to sit. You want to make sure that you go ahead and sand it down so it looks like it's as smooth as possible. Let's apply some copper never sees. Now it's time to get the rotor on here. Now at this point, I always just take one of my lug nuts. I'm going to go ahead and bottom it out right against this rotor. Essentially, it's going to hold it still for us while we continue. Now it's time to push back the caliper pistons. When you do this, you need to make sure you push them both back at the same time. If you try pressing just one, typically the other one's going to try pressing out. Just keep that in mind. Now we're just going to double check the caliper. Once again, you want to make sure you don't see any fluid coming along where those pistons are. If you see any type of fluid, typically it's going to be brake fluid, in which case you need to replace the caliper. Aside from that, just go ahead and give it a quick cleaning. As you can tell on ours, we have a lot of rust and debris that's built up on this, and I don't want any of it to fall into the brakes. Once you feel as though you have it sufficiently cleaned, let's continue on with a little high temperature caliper lube. We're going to go along each of the pistons. Once you have both of those coated, make your way along the backside of each of these 3 mounting ears. Time to go ahead and clean up the caliper bracket. The first thing that I always do is go ahead and remove my caliper bracket tins. Just go ahead and grab onto it. We're going to give it a little wiggle and we can remove it. Generally, I just give them a quick inspection, set it aside. We'll go ahead and get this one off of there as well. Same thing, quick inspection. The next thing we're going to do is start removing our caliper slider pins from the bracket. For these, what I like to do is go ahead and grab onto the boot itself and the pin. I'm going to try to twist it, and essentially I want to break it free from the bracket. Once it's broken free, you can go ahead and remove it. After you remove that, the next thing we want to do is take the boot off of the pin. Just go ahead and place it down on a flat surface. Go ahead and grab the boot and slide it on down. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the caliper pin itself. Now, generally on one of them, for each caliper bracket, you're going to find that you have a rubber insulating bushing. This is essentially a vibration dampener. You want to make sure you put this back in the exact same slider port when you go to put everything back together. I'm just going to go ahead and set this off to the side. We'll fully remove the other one as well. No rubber bushing. Now at this point, the bracket's completely stripped down. So what I want to do is pay attention for any large rust or rot flakes on it. Essentially, I just want to go ahead and clean off anything that might get caught in the brakes. Now that I have the larger areas off of there, the next thing that we want to pay attention to is the areas that we removed the tins from. Now where we want to clean is right along this groove right here and all the way up along this ridge. We'll do the same on this side right here, and once this side of the bracket's done, you're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, at this point I went ahead and I cleaned up both sides of the bracket where the tins are supposed to be. The next area that we want to pay attention to is the area on the bracket where your slider pin boots are supposed to ride. If you look very close where my index finger is, you can see that there's a small groove. You need to make sure that that groove is completely clean and free of any debris. To clean this, you can use a wire brush or maybe even a wire wheel. Once you have both sides cleaned on the outside, the next thing we want to do is clean the port that leads on the inside, right where that slider pin's supposed to ride. To clean these, typically all I use is a little bit of parts cleaner and a bore brush. Okay, at this point, we've done everything we can to the bracket as far as cleaning goes. Let's go ahead and set this aside, and now we're going to grab onto our 2 caliper slider pins. Keep in mind, while you're cleaning these, one of them does have that vibration dampener on it. So when you clean it, you want to be extremely careful not to damage it, whether it's with some type of scraping tool or even with parts cleaner. Parts cleaner could swell this rubber. Just go ahead and wipe it down, and then pay special attention to this area up here. Now that I have it wiped down, like I said, we're going to pay attention up here. Right up along where my thumb is, you can see another little groove. That's exactly where that slider boot is going to go. Once again, you want to make sure it's clean and free of any debris. Now at this point, this slider pin looks good. If you found that you had any type of buildup on this that didn't want to scrape off, you might have to go ahead and replace the slider pin. This one looks fine, so I'll set it aside, and now I'm going to go ahead and clean up the other one the same. Once you have both of your slider pins cleaned, go ahead and set those aside, and we'll move along to the caliper slider boots. The area of the boots that you want to pay attention to is mostly the inside, and I say mostly because the outside matters as well. It's a good idea to just give them a little squeeze and make sure they're nice and soft and pliable, and they don't look like they're torn or worn in any way. Assuming it looks good, let's go ahead and take a nice clean rag. We're going to put it through the center. It's important to make sure you don't use any type of solvent on this because it will swell the rubber, and of course it won't be useful after that. Once you feel as though you have it cleaned well enough, go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other one. Once everything's nice and cleaned, it's time to start putting it together. Let's start with our slider pins. we're going to add a little bit of high temperature caliper lubricant to each one of these slider pins. You want to make sure that you coat the entire shaft. And then of course, make your way all the way down into the groove of the slider pin. Let's also continue on with a little bit more of that caliper lube, and we're going to go along the slider port where the slider pin's going to go. You don't need to put very much on the inside because of course we did coat the slider pin, but you definitely want to put some along that outer ridge that we went ahead and cleaned. Now once you have everything lubricated, continue on with the boot. We're going to go ahead and take that and we're going to slide it right onto the slider pin. Bring it all the way up into that groove. Now we can go ahead and put it into the slider port. Once again, you want to make sure that you put the one with the vibration dampener into the original hole that you had removed it from. Slide it right on down, and now what we want to happen is the boot to sit inside the groove of this right here, the caliper bracket, and of course the slider pin. Once it seems as though it is in there, just go ahead and give it a couple twists and wiggle it in and out. Essentially, we want to make sure that everything's nice and secure and well lubricated. After that, do the other slider pin. Let's continue with a little bit of high temperature grease, and we're going to go along each of the ears that we went ahead and sanded down. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction, not to mention it's also going to help keep moisture away from the area. Let's take those new tins and we're going to slide them right in place. Now when I press this in, I want to be paying attention to the center area here. You can see that there's a couple little locking tabs, so as I press this in, I also want to reach under here and I'm just going to go ahead and force it right underneath that caliper bracket. After that, grab onto the tin. You're going to want to give it a little wiggle to make sure it doesn't fall off. Assuming that seems good, turn it around and do the exact same thing. Let's get the bracket on the vehicle. Once it's in place, go ahead and take your mounting bolts. Goes right on there. Once you have both of these started, we're going to go ahead and snug them up. Once they're snug, you can go ahead and torque them to 90 foot-pounds. Let's take those pads, we'll put them into the position inside of the caliper bracket. When you install the pads, they should just want to slide right in. If they don't, that essentially means that your caliper bracket might not be cleaned well enough. Let's take that caliper and we're going to put it right on over the brake pads. Line up the slider pins so they can fit into position. Time to install the two caliper slider bolts. Typically, it's a good idea to go ahead and use some red thread locker. Once you have both of the bolts started, go ahead and torque each of them to 26 foot-pounds. All right, just double check to make sure everything's torqued down, and now we can move along to the ABS wire. We're going to go ahead and put that right into the clip that's on the flex hose. Should slide right into position. Once it's in there, go ahead and lock it down. Now we're going to slide this up into its locked position as well. Make sure the hook's closed down. Let's move along, resecuring the rest of the ABS wire all the way up the flex hose. Double check it, make sure it's completely secured. Now it's time to get the wheel up on here. Let's go ahead and start on all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. After that, we can bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Now we can torque the lug nuts in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Of course, if you do have a center cover, go ahead and put that on now. Paying attention to the back, you can see 5 slots. They line up with 5 lug nuts. Line it up, bonk it in position. Okay friends, we got one side of the brake job done. Now of course, you're going to want to make sure you do the exact same thing over on the other side of the vehicle. Immediately after that, climb inside the passenger compartment and pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. After that, go ahead and take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.